Welcome back to Cross-Threaded, your wide open moto podcast. This week, we're going to do a little breakdown of what happened at WSX in Australia. And of course, our new segment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But let's jump into it. So, this was round three of the WSX series. A couple of the headlines going into it was, of course, Eli Tomac making his second ride on that KTM, the return of Hayden Deegan on his 450. So that was going to be a good battle that everyone was looking towards. And of course, Ken Roxon has been looking good as well. But first and foremost, starting off the night, we'll start off with the 250 class. It was really kind of the same story that we've seen this whole season. Max Anstey was pretty much dominant, kept a perfect streak alive, but there were some headlines and a couple incidences that did make the night, a little bit more interesting. Starting off with, Enzo Lopes ends up being the fastest qualifier and ends up getting Super Bowl. So it's really good to see Enzo Lopes really getting some of that speed back, and kind of putting his name up there, and putting up a fight. Especially with this track, it was a good track. It was a good track layout, good design, but it was really dry. To me, it did remind me a lot of, say, Glendale. It's known for one of the more harder packed tracks on the Supercross circuit. So very dry out there, very slick. It looked like in some spots, but really good to see Enzo Lopes go out there and kind of make a statement. Hopefully, this means that he's just going to keep getting better. But speaking of the racing, Lopes was a little bit closer to Anstey in that first race. McElrath continued to have some struggles, and Anstey ended up getting the win in that first moto. The second race, Lopes unfortunately had a pretty bad wreck in the whoops that resulted in a DNF. So kind of disappointing, right? He had a really strong night going for him. And then with that crash, it just basically kind of hit the reset button. So hopefully when he comes back this upcoming weekend, he'll be good and ready to go. And yeah, hopefully he can kind of get some of this momentum back. Big shout out to Colin Park. There's been a lot of hype around him. I know in his interviews he's talked about how, this is the best that he's felt riding in quite some time, and his starts just weren't there to kind of put his name up in there. To me, I was kind of a little bit more skeptical. I needed to see it before I actually believed it. But he put in a great ride, ended up getting second in race two. So really solid ride by Colin Park. And then a race three, we actually got to see a pretty decent battle going. Shane McElrath ended up getting the whole shot. Um, Held off Anstey for a good amount of the race until Anstey eventually got him, and then he kind of put on that lead and kind of checked out. But another solid ride for Colin Park as well. But no change to the story here. Anstey is still perfect. He really doesn't have very much competition. I mean, he is the only factory rider in this class, so he's kind of doing what I would expect him to do. He's a star guy riding his full factory bike. He's going to be ramped up and ready to go for Anaheim 1, at the end of this series. But overall, he's looked great out there, and he's dominated, every step of the way. And I believe that domination is going to continue through these last two rounds. But let's go into the good, the bad, and our ugly segment. For this 250 class, the good to me, Colin Park, right? He's been talking about, all this hype that he has the speed, he feels good, he just hasn't gotten the starts. And this weekend, he got some good starts, and he was able to battle up at the top and kind of put his name up on the box. So shout out to Colin Park. The bad to me is Cody Shock. I've been kind of on this from the very beginning. A couple of shows ago, we talked about, maybe Shock is kind of plateaued. He just doesn't really seem like he's been improving much. I mean, Lopes has seemed to be a little bit better of the rider. Of course, they're on the same team with that Rick Ware racing team, but I don't know what's going on. I expected a little bit more with Shock. To least battle it with Shane McElrath. I know McElrath is the defending champion in this series, but he's still at the end of it, towards the end of his career, whereas Cody Shock, is very well might be in his prime, maybe towards the end of his prime, but I don't know. I'm just waiting to see if Shock's really going to make that big jump in this class, and I really just haven't seen it yet. So I'm curious to see how it's going to go for the rest of these next two rounds, but I really like to see Shock get up there and battle, maybe get a race win, in Anstey's streak. But I just haven't seen it yet to make me a believer. And then the ugly, unfortunately, the night started off great, but I did have to give it to Enzo Lopes. Ends up going down, and all that momentum that he's been building basically just went out the window. Hopefully he's okay. I haven't heard much about it. I don't believe he lined up for race three, or if he did, he just wasn't able to ride very good. So hopefully he is going to be okay, and we can see him bounce back this weekend. But all in all, this 250 class has been kind of a bit of a snoozer. Not really, much competition, with Ansty, and unfortunately, I think that's going to be, the continuing tale of this WS series as we have 2 rounds left to go. Next, we got our 450 class. Once again, a couple more surprises here too. Joey Savatgy goes out quickest in qualifying and is also the fastest in Super Bowl. So tops Ken Roxon, tops Deegan, and tops Eli Tomac. So shout out to Joey Savatgy. Good to see him. Putting in some solid rides on that Honda, and we'll get into the racing on the night how it goes. Um, Race one, man, there was a really great battle. I think there's about 4 or 5 guys that were kind of battling back and forth. So that was cool. There's a little bit of a change. You see some of those guys, Christian Craig, we'll get into, how his night went. Deegan, of course, being back out there. But this track was pretty start dependent for the most part. It was a really tight left-handed turn, and it was pretty short. So any of the guys that are basically on the outside of that doghouse, they didn't really have much of a chance because they were going to get pushed wide as soon as they went into that first corner. But race one, Roxon comes through from fifth place. There was a little bit of a contact between Savachi and Craig in that first race too. It sounds like it wasn't intentional. It just sounded like Savachi went for the quad, and Craig ended up tripling and coming up a little bit short, which caused Savachi to kind of run into him. But they did talk afterwards, and Savachi basically owned up, said, "Hey, that definitely wasn't intentional, but." Craig had an interview with, Pulp MX, and he stated that, he wasn't surprised, because I think it was the last round they had an incident as well where he got hit pretty hard for that position. So it definitely seems like those teammates are going to do whatever it takes to win it and to get that next spot. So something to keep an eye on as we go into these last couple rounds, because of course, Ken Roxy, Eli Tomac, Deegan, all won't be there. Um, and then Deegan, in that first race, he ended up getting a really good jump out of the gate, but once again, he was just on the outside of the doghouse, and he ended up getting pushed wide and was essentially, knocked back to a dead last start. So, he did get a good jump though. Looked like he had a good chance at it, but at the end of the day, that start was just too much. And then going into race two, both Roxon and Tomac had bad starts, so it just seems like the consistency just still isn't there for those guys. Last week we saw Roxon when he battled Tomac. If he got a bad start, Tomac ended up winning, and then if Roxon got the start, Roxon ended up winning. But this time around, they both got bad starts, so kind of surprising. Specifically more on the Tomac side. We all know that this past year his struggles were the starts, and with the class that's so deep in Supercross and Motocross, you can't really make up the time in bad starts unless, of course, you're Jet Lawrence. But even in this weaker field, it was still a little too much for Tomac to overcome. We finally got to see what we were looking for. Deegan ended up getting a top 5 start in that race, and was actually running up, towards the front until he kind of played into his little digging games that he always did. Him and Joey Savachi were kind of going back and forth. Deegan was doing the same bullshit where he was like looking over his shoulder, trying to brake check each other. There was an interview afterwards with Savachi that was floating around that Savachi said that he wasn't doing anything intentional. They just wanted Deegan to just kind of to race forward, and Deegan thought that he was going to clean him out. So there's definitely some bad blood or animosity between the two of those things, but that's just something that as Deegan, you got to leave that shit in the 250 class. I mean, you going into this 450 class, it allowed these other guys to catch right back up to him, and then at the end of it, Deegan ends up, washing his front and ends up losing his position because of all the games that he was playing. So hopefully it's a lesson learned. This isn't a 250 class, to where he's faster than anyone else out in the field. He's got to be smart. He's got to learn to race forward and not worry about the guys in the back. And, if he gets parked, he gets parked, deal with it. But at the end, it ended up being worse for him anyways because him not paying attention while he's out on the track. And then Tomac also had, more struggles as well. He had a weird slide out also in this race that kind of prevented him from, finishing as good as he could have. Really surprising to see the struggles that Tomac had on this track. Like I said, very similar to like a Glendale. Obviously, the track's not as big, but Glendale's a really hard packed track, really slick, which we all know Tomac does great at Glendale for the most part, and he just never really seemed to find his rhythm, all night. And it's crazy because he was talking about how much traction he felt with this KTM, and on this track, it just really seemed like he was making a lot of mistakes. And then Webb, he's out there as well, kind of threw his name out there. I mean, he basically he got up front and he avoided all the chaos. It was a great ride for him. Good to see him out on the box as well. Obviously, we saw him a couple weekends ago at the OzX, at the Paris race. So it's good to kind of see him get out there. I'm sure it felt good for him to get back on that top spot. But once again, this was kind of just a one in race. He won't be returning either. Now, as far as race number three, quite possibly maybe one of the better races of the night, if not the best. Deegan ends up getting a top two start, and he holds it. I mean, he looked really good. He wasn't able to catch up to Craig, but he did make some impressive passes on Tomac. He ended up passing Tomac, I believe it was through the whoops. And even after that point, he ended up basically dropping Tomac. So that was really surprising. Of course, I did think that Deegan was going to make some progress, from that first ride that we saw in Argentina. But for him to straight up go out there and pass Tomac, it was one of the longer races too. It was a 12-minute race, but to pass Tomac and then not only that, but just kind of check out on him. I mean, Tomac never really got close to him after the fact. And then on top of that, you look at Christian Craig, great ride. He was the same thing. Him and Tomac went back and forth for a little bit, but Craig ended up taking the lead away, and checked out as well. So very interesting. Not something that I had, in the cards with, Craig winning, but let alone passing and beating Tomac. And same thing for Deegan. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting. We're gonna see. I think Tomac still has some work to do before we get to A1. He looked great in round two in Canada, and it looked like everything was clicking. But I don't know. You go to this track, and maybe it was the track conditions that he just wasn't, comfortable with. But it was definitely a step back for Tomac. And to me, the bike just seemed like it was still kind of bouncing around. Like I said, he had a couple slide outs, a couple mistakes. And keep in mind, right, these are short races. These are, heat races, maybe a little bit longer. That last one, how is Tomac going to look when he has to do 20 plus minutes with a stack field with an absolute beat track if he's still, seems to be fighting this track with a much weaker field and a much, shorter races too. So we're going to see. It's definitely something that I think it kind of takes the wind out of the sails a little bit from all the Tomac hype, but he does still have, a little over a month and a half or so to get ready for A1. So we'll see what kind of time and effort he puts into it. Uh, so once again, Craig ends up winning race three, and to me, this is an awesome story. I mean, Craig kind of fell off the map there for a little bit. We didn't see him race for a while. Then he had that stint with Star Racing that he was coaching, Deegan. He never raced, but then they ended up splitting up, and then he kind of went MIA, and no one really knew what was going on. Of course, he had his injuries too. Um, but man, it's great to see Craig back. He looks really good on that Honda as well, still blitzing the whoops, better than he ever has. And I'm excited, right? It's going to be a three-man battle heading into the rest of the season. Really, kind of two. You're going to have, I think it's Joey Savacci, Christian Craig, and then you have Jason Anderson. That will all be battling for this title. Of course, Ken Roxon, wild card, he won't be finishing the last two. Same thing with Eli Tomac, Webb, Deegan. Those guys won't be there. So I don't know. Does this? We were worried that the excitement for this WSX round was going to fall off when those big names dropped off, but with Christian Craig, getting that win in there, Anderson hasn't looked good on that Suzuki yet. So I'm not sure how much of a factor he's really going to play. And of course, Savachi, they are teammates, but I mean, they've made it very clear that if it's going to come down to a title, these guys are going to bang bars, and someone might end up hitting the ground. But you know, a lot of people had Anderson and maybe the favorite to win this title, with the big guys out, and it just hasn't been there. I mean, he had a really bad race, this weekend, ended up getting hit for the rear, tangled up. Argentina wasn't good either. So to me, this whole start with the Suzuki and Anderson just hasn't been going well at all. And I don't see how it's going to improve that much as we head into A1. Um, and then you'll have Colt Nichols. He'll be filling in for Ken Roxy, going to these next rounds. It'll be interesting to see how Colt stacks up. Will he be a podium guy battling with Anderson, Craig, and Savachi? I'm not sure. We'll see. I know he's been riding quite a bit. Um, but yeah, I mean, we'll kind of see. That's something I'm going to keep an eye on. I've been someone that is hoping to see Colt kind of make this step up. Obviously, he was the 250 champion in Supercross, and I don't know. I want to see him kind of run this step, run more, consistent top tens, and hopefully with this WSX trip that he gets some confidence and he does put it on the box. And who knows, maybe he does get a race win. It's definitely in the cards. Considering who he's racing. I mean, this is basically he kind of falls in this territory of these guys. The Craig, the Savachis, Colt, they're kind of all in that same realm. Anderson, maybe not so much, but Anderson on the Suzuki seems to be like he's taking a step back. So this could be, a four-man battle for a race, and we could see different winners at each race too, depending on the start. So something we'll definitely keep an eye on into these final two rounds. But I mean, overall, I thought it was a good night. Going into the good, the bad, and the ugly, for me, the good has to go to Christian Craig. Seeing him get up, get that first race win, is awesome. It's been a long time coming and really cool to see. You could throw Deegan up there as well, with his that final race, how he performed, but first race wasn't that great. I think he ended up getting around sixth. And then the second race could have been good, but once again, him and his antics and his games ended up, biting him in the rear and, kind of really ruined a chance at him having another great ride. But for me, the good, you got to give it to Christian Craig. Great race to cap off the night. He did it with some, impressive talent out there. The bad to me, it has to go to Tomac. Such a high. He looked so good coming out of Canada, and then going into this week, he never looked good. He never looked comfortable. He struggled with his starts. He went down a couple of times. He got passed by Deegan and Craig. He didn't get any race wins. I think Tomac ended up finishing fourth or fifth, so he wasn't even on the podium for this round two. So definitely not what you expect from Tomac. I'm sure those aren't his expectations either, but especially coming off of that Canada round with all that momentum and everyone talking about how good he looked. I just didn't see it this time around. But we'll see. A1 still, like I said, a month and a half away. He's got time to prepare and get a little bit get better. And then the ugly, I kind of touched up on it. It's got to be Anderson. This move to Suzuki so far has been a nightmare. I mean, he hasn't looked good. He had a lot of issues in round one. Round two was a little bit better, but then once again, round three, he's just having more and more problems. So we'll see with these final two rounds. Maybe he'll step up and realize that, hey, I am better than these other three or four guys, and maybe he'll get some confidence in that Suzuki. But as of so far, it just hasn't been a good start for Anderson and this new Suzuki ride. But that's it for WSX round three. Like I said, it's an exciting night of races. A lot of headlines coming in. A lot of guys stepped up. A lot of names that we don't usually see up there in the spotlight. So it's always cool to see these guys kind of throwing their name in the hat. But as we head into round four, I mean, really, all the story is going to be in that 450 class. Oh, sorry, I just got the hiccups out of nowhere. But it's going to be that 450 class. Who's going to step up? Who's going to take this series by the reins? Is it going to be Savachi? Is it going to be Christian Craig riding this new fire? Or is Anderson going to get his head out of his ass and ride to his potential and get the Suzuki, up and running? Or is Colt going to step in and show us, the improvement that he's made during the offseason? We don't know. The only way that we will know is to, of course, tune in. But we will be right back again after WSX round four. Then there's round five, and then we'll have a little bit of break, and we'll be back to do our preseason kickoff, get all the boys back on, and start talking about A1 and what we think we're going to see. Deegan did make the announcement that he is officially going to go to um, he's officially going to go back to the 250 class. So the 450, stint is over. So that was a lot of things that people were talking about that they thought that now he's going to be on a 450 at A1, but it sounds like he is going to be full blown going back to the 250 class. Still not sure whether or not it's going to be East Coast or West Coast. Of course, the West Coast is more of his, home being from California, defending champ, gets to run that number one plate. However, um, I think it'd be a better move for him to go out to the East Coast, learn those tracks, get a little bit better. That way, when he does make that jump to 450 the following year, he'll have a little bit of taste of both coast. Um, of course, bad news. We found out that Joe Shimoda ended up breaking, a little bit breaking his neck, had to get surgery. It sounds like he's gonna miss Supercross, and that to me was Deegan's biggest competition. So now it really doesn't matter what coast Deegan's gonna go on because he's not gonna have to race Joe Shimoda either way. Big bummer for Shimoda. Obviously, he's had all that momentum after WSX, re-signed with HRC, and now it sounds like he's gonna be missing out on the Supercross series. So big bummer. According to PulpMX, it doesn't sound like they're gonna fill in Joe Shimoda's ride either. So it's gonna be one less Honda out there. Obviously, the 250 class, they just have him and Chance Hymas, which we all know Hymas is hit or miss. Especially in Supercross. He hasn't really shown any solid rides or let alone, finish an entire season in Supercross. So hopefully that he can make that step up and turn around there. Um and then the other news, share this post on our Instagram, TikTok, the official news that Mukoff and Club at Max are going to part ways. No announcement as far as who's going to step up and be that title sponsor. The owner made it seem like, hey, we'll fund this thing by ourselves if we have to. um, but yeah, kind of a big news there, right? They're a great team. They're borderline that factory support team. So I really hope they can find that title sponsor and keep that program going, which Daniel Blair did announce today. I think he said that it's going to be Hunter Yoder and Simons, no, Hunter Yoder and I believe Maximus Volen are going to line up on the West Coast. So shout out to them for not leaving us hanging, letting us know what coast they're going to be on. Hopefully some other teams follow suit so that we know who's going to be lining up where. But all in all, that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Of course, subscribe on YouTube. We're on Spotify, Instagram, TikTok, of course. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them into the comment box. I'll be happy to address them. But another great round of off-season races. We got two more to go, and we'll see you next week. See you later.